My name is Budiman Minasni from the University of Sydney. So welcome everyone to this webinar series. This is the 4/1000 scientific webinar series. So in case you're wondering what's 4/1000, 4/1000 is an international initiative that was set up at the COP21 a few years ago by the French Minister of Agriculture. The idea of the 4/1000 is that to encourage farmers and landowners to increase their soil carbon in the face of food security and climate change. And there's no better topic today that we are very happy to share with you a webinar on the topic of soil carbon and crop yield. So to start off, we have two speakers here. So Dr. Dominic Woolf from Cornell University and Dr. Mauricio Cherubin from the University of Sao Paulo. So the format of the webinar today is that the two speakers will present their research on the soil carbon and yield, and then we will have some discussion led by our scientific and technical committee member, Dr. Beverly Henry. So to start off, let's start off with Dr. Dominic Woolf. Dominic is a senior research associate at the School of Integrative Plant Science, Soil, Crop, and at the Cornell University. So he has been long in the research. His research is focusing on the challenge of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And using modeling, he evaluates the efficacy of natural-based solutions such as soil carbon sequestration, land restoration, and sustainable management practice. And his research is informing policy decisions by assessing the economic and environmental trade-off. So welcome, Dominic. So first off, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this invitation, to talk a bit about soil organic carbon and crop yields. Most of this talk was going to focus on one major aspect of that, which appeared in an article in Nature Geoscience last year, but I'm also happy to discuss, broaden the discussion out apart from that, but I'm going to focus a lot on the results from that paper. But before we get into that, we'll just start off with one quote here. Could have been chosen many, but this is just an example. This is from a paper by Amelong et al. In 2020, a few years ago, that soil health benefits from sequestering carbon may help to close yield gaps in arable soils due to associated improvements in nutrient supplies, water holding capacity, and soil structural stability. Now, the reason I read this out is not because this particular quote is very different to what you see elsewhere, but it's just an example of what we see everywhere, that there's just a common belief, it's a common knowledge even, that having more soil carbon will result in more fertile soils, and that will benefit crop yields. And this is something that people have known intuitively for decades, if not even nearly a century now. However, the actual evidence behind that is surprisingly weak when you start to dig into it. We don't have as much hard evidence to support how large that quantitative effect is. So this is something we wanted to try and understand better. Now, so why is it that people for a long time have had this intuitive understanding that, of course, soil carbon must lead to greater crop yields? And I think that in the main part, that comes from two widespread and well-known observations. The first is that if we have a high organic matter soil, we consider it rich and fertile because that organic matter can be a source of nutrients when we degrade that soil. So what I mean by that is, if we look at the pictures on the right, here we've got a few paired examples of forest soils and adjacent cropland soils. These are taken from some studies I did in East Africa, but we see similar pictures elsewhere. Whereas the original native soil is very rich in organic matter, but over time, as you till and produce annual crops on that land, it becomes extremely depleted in soil organic matter. And over the course of time, what we've done is we've actually released all the stored nutrients in those high organic matter soils and made them available to fertilize the crops. And that's one of the main reasons that we think of high organic matter soils as being very fertile, is because they can provide nutrients. However, they can only do that if we actually decompose the organic matter. They won't release any nutrients if we just keep that organic matter there. And I think that the other reason that we often see a common understanding of this connection between SOC and crop yields is that we see a correlation between soils which have high organic matter and where there's high vegetation productivity. But a large part of that correlation may come not from the fact that the soil has improved the vegetation, but the other way around, that where we've got a lot of vegetation, that means that we're producing a lot of organic matter, which then goes into the soil. So that correlation is an observation, no sort of connection, but it actually doesn't prove that the soil organic carbon has improved the vegetation growth. So really, this remains an open question, which is how large is the causal effect of soil organic carbon on yields, independent of its actual capacity to supply nutrients to the soil. And that question becomes really critical when we're thinking about building up soil organic carbon in order to address climate change by sequestering carbon. Because when we do that, we're no longer using organic matter as a resource that can provide nutrients. At that point, we actually have to invest nutrients in order to build organic matter. We're reversing that trend. So really what we need to know is how much the inherent properties of a soil with more organic matter affect crop yields, quite independently from how much we can release nutrients from that soil to provide better crop growth. Now, that's the answer to that question has been quite elusive for a long time for a number of reasons. And we were lucky to be able to make some headway in this, to make some headway on this question by teaming up with the China Agricultural University in Beijing, who were able to provide us access to an extremely rich, unusual data set, which had been collected by an enormous field trial undertaken by the Chinese government. They had 14,000 controlled field trials on 3 crops. And the way these were conducted was these were on-farm trials, but at each trial, it wasn't the farmer that was conducting it. They would have a local researcher actually conducting the trial, so they would pay the farmer for the use of that land for 1 year in order to be able to conduct a controlled trial on an extremely large sample of different sites across the country. And on each site, there were a lot of different treatments, mostly fertilizer treatments, so different levels of fertilizer inputs. So we ended up with around nearly 70,000 treatments overall. And this is extremely rare to find such a rich data set to work with, to really dig into questions like this. And not only is it a large data set, but another really nice thing about this data set is its diversity. So China is a very large country that covers a lot of different agroecosystems. And this data set actually covers 7 of the 8 climate zones, the IPCC climate zones within its borders, from tropical through to temperate zones. It's got a large number of different soil texture classes and soil orders, pH ranges from very acidic to alkaline soils, and soil organic carbon levels from extremely low, almost close to zero soil organic carbon, through to extremely rich ones. So there's a very diverse data set as well as being very large, which really gave us a chance to make some really good advances in this question. One of the things that really helped us to do was to be able to isolate much better than has been possible in the past what is the causal effect of soil organic carbon on crop yields. Now, previous studies have suffered from a couple of issues in this regard, and one of them is that there are a lot of confounding factors when we try to understand the causal interaction between soil organic carbon and net primary production, NPP, or crop yields. And one of those is that there are a lot of confounding factors. There are a lot of parameters which simultaneously can affect soil organic carbon and can also affect NPP or crop yields on the other hand. So rather than a causal effect of soil organic carbon on NPP, that can be masked by a correlation from these confounding factors, which can be due to things like climate, fertilization, land management, hydrology, soil properties, and a range of other things. Now, in this data set, we were able to account for and eliminate a lot of these confounding factors. Firstly, because it was a controlled trial over this large geography. What the researchers did was they applied best management practices at all sites, which meant that we had a consistent approach to management, including fertilization, tillage, choice of cultivars, weed and pest control, irrigation, timing of crop calendars. All of these things were managed consistently across this very large trial, which removed a lot of the variation from these confounding factors, which in previous trials not only do have these confounding factors, but often that they are not well documented in the data. So it's hard to even account for them in analysis of the data from previous studies. And the other thing we were able to do is, although some parameters can't be controlled, such as the climate, soil, and hydrology, what was available in this study was a lot of data was collected on these other uncontrolled variables. So we've got rich data measurements on site of climate, soil properties, both physical, chemical properties, and also hydrological aspects. And the other big issue, which has really stymied our ability to understand the causal effect in the past, is that the causality can actually go in both directions. That we can also have a situation where if you have higher crop growth for whatever reason, that will lead to greater crop residue production at the same time, which leads to greater organic matter inputs to the soil, which then results into higher soil organic carbon levels. And again, this study allowed us to really tease out the direction of the causality to a large extent. Because the trials were conducted over a single season, there really wasn't any opportunity for this reverse causality to feature in the data. That we measure soil organic carbon levels at the start, and they essentially unchanged over the period of the season under which the trials are undertaken. So this is why this data was really a godsend to be able to get this sort of amazing amount of data. And the approach we took to try and understand it was we used a machine learning model approach. We tried out a number of different machine learning models and use a random forest in the end because it performed very well to predict yield as a result of all the covariate data that were collected across these large number of trials. And that gave us an R-squared of over 80%, meaning that more than 80% of the variability in yields could be explained by the data, which is much higher than is typically achievable with these kinds of trials, and it's an indication that the researchers have done a reasonably good job of both measuring and accounting for any confounding variables and also controlling for the ones that they can. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have such a high R-squared. So that gives us confidence that the data are able to actually provide us a good insight into the underlying processes. From this machine learning model, we can then tease out the impact of soil organic carbon alone in what's called a partial dependence plot. You see in the bottom left then. And then that allows us to define something called that we call the soil organic carbon yield gap, which we define as meaning the amount by which yields could be improved if we improved soil organic carbon. So it's a yield gap due to soil organic carbon. Then we also wanted to understand the drivers behind the reasons behind that yield gap, not just to quantify it. So then we also built a second machine learning model to predict the size of that soil organic carbon yield gap, and did a feature importance analysis to understand what the causes of that are. So starting off by looking at the yield model, so the first model in the bottom left of our methods there, unsurprisingly, nitrogen fertilizer is the best predictor of yield, and that's really no surprise there. Aridity index was then next highest up there. So water and nitrogen supply are critical to crop production. We already know that. But what was nice to see in this, that soil organic carbon had a reasonably large and very measurable effect on yields. It's about a fifth of the size of these highest ones of nitrogen fertilizer and water provision, but it's large enough that we can actually quantify the size of that effect quite effectively. And one thing that was really interesting and nice to see about that is that I mentioned we had different fertilization rates and in the different treatments in this study. And what we saw was that under any fertilization, so even when you had perfect fertilization, or if you had excess fertilization, or if you had a nutrient deprived cropping system, in all of those cases, we saw that soil organic carbon could increase yield, indicating that it can remain a complementary strategy on top of addressing yield gaps due to things like nitrogen or water deficits, that soil organic carbon improvements can always have a role to play on top of these other strategies. So here are some of the partial dependent plots we have there. So you see on the x-axis of these graphs that we have the soil organic carbon level, and on the y-axis we have the predicted yield from our model. So this is how much the yield would be, and this is the average across all of that large data set. Obviously, we can do the same thing for any individual location, but what we see in this graph here is the mean effect across the entire data set. And in the blue, that's the predicted yield relative to soil organic carbon. And then in the red line, what we've done is we can measure by subtracting from the maximum yield possible at optimum soil organic carbon levels, we can quantify the size of the yield gap, how much we could improve yields if we were to address soil organic carbon sequestration. And one of the things we saw is that the size of the amount of soil organic carbon that leads to this optimum yield effect varies across crops. Previous studies have typically indicated a consistent sort of value of around 2% carbon as being universal average, whereas we can sort of show that actually it depends a lot on which crop you're growing, with yields going up even to very high organic carbon levels with maize, and wheat plateauing at much lower levels. And also in the map in the bottom right there, it varies a lot depending on where you are in the world, with higher optimum levels in temperate zones than in the tropics. So you don't need as much soil organic carbon in the more tropical areas in order to reach your maximum, or to reach the point beyond which there are no further benefits. And the next thing we want to do, of course, is to understand the reasons behind that. So looking at the drivers of the soil organic carbon yield gap. And the top right, you can see all of the drivers, or the top 20 of them. But one that I'd really like to focus on, which always emerged as being the most important predictor of the yield gap from soil organic carbon, is aridity index. So how dry or moist the climate is where you're growing. And there was a very clear trend across the data that the more arid sites had a larger impact of soil organic carbon on yields. And in the driest sites, you can get up to an average of around 20% increase in yields if you were able to bring your soil organic carbon stocks up to their optimum level. Although we weren't able to test that in this particular study, this indicates that the improvements in water holding capacity from adding soil organic carbon, not only the most important mechanism, but could point to a role of soil organic carbon providing resilience against droughts. We didn't actually have any drought events really that we could use to test that in these data, but clearly the importance of soil organic carbon in managing water resources is a key factor here. So I think we could also expect to see sort of yield stability and drought resilience as being big factors as well. Interestingly, there was also an uptick in the yield gap in moister regions, which can't be explained by greater water availability. And one of the mechanisms we think might be going on in the very wet areas is that soil organic carbon could provide protection against leaching out nutrients, because it can increase the cation exchange capacity of these soils and retain nutrients better in the soil. So then the next thing we really wanted to do was try to understand, because we've got such a diverse climate, soils, and agroecological conditions in the Chinese test data, we tried to extrapolate that to the global situation. Now, of course, globally, there is a number of very different cropping practices that are used. So we can't extrapolate from Chinese agriculture to agricultural practices that are very different elsewhere. What we can do is extrapolate to what impact could soil organic carbon have if they were practicing best management practices elsewhere. So if across the world people were using optimal fertilization, irrigation, weed and pest control, etc., under those situations, how much more could we get from soil organic carbon? And what we found is that if we could increase yields up to their optimum levels, we would on average across the world increase crop production by about 4.3%, which is roughly around 640 million people's energy needs. And obviously there's variation around the world, and those values are much highest in the more dry areas. So in that map, you can see across Middle East and North African areas, we see the yellower countries. So across some of those regions, we actually see an even greater benefit from soil organic carbon. And if there's also variation between crops, with maize and wheat benefiting the most, rice very much less so, because in most flooded rice production systems, soil organic carbon is already quite high, so it's already close to its optimum value. So we don't get a lot of additional benefit on yields by increasing soil organic carbon any further. But this is the sort of sobering part of the study, is that, of course, in many parts of the world, it's simply not possible to reach the very high optimum soil organic carbon levels that we would need to reach in order to get these big yield impacts. So we're constrained by the biophysical ability of organic matter production and climates in these areas by how much we could actually increase soil organic carbon. And when we take that into account, the sort of technical potential for increasing soil organic carbon, if we did zero tillage and maximized organic matter inputs, and we used cover crops and all of these sort of scalable processes we know how to do, if we were using all of those, how much soil organic carbon could we get, and how much would that increase crop yields? And it turns out that number is actually a lot smaller, even much less than 1% increase in crop yields. Also worth bearing in mind that 0.7% would take at least 20 to 30 years to realize, because we don't increase soil organic carbon to its maximum level immediately. It takes time to build up those stocks. So the year-on-year increases in yields would be actually quite small in this case. It still, over time, equates to around 120 million people's energy needs, but so it's not negligible, but it would be hard to measure against the background noise of all the other things that affect yields and will lead to changing yields over time. So to summarize that, so what does that leave us? It means that if we were able to increase soil organic carbon to their optimum levels by using methods that are beyond what we know now as these scalable approaches, such as cover crops, high residue returns, and no-till, and these kind of other practices, if we could do other things like synthetic biology to improve crop cultivars for greater below-ground allocation, or if we could manipulate the soil microbiome, or if we use biochar, if we did all these other host of other blue sky things, in theory, we might be able to get up to about 4.3% increase in crop yields. Although I think we can't forget the fact that under currently available management practices, it's a very much smaller amount. Therefore, I think we can say that yield improvements from higher soil organic carbons are unlikely at a global scale to be the thing which is going to drive soil carbon sequestration. So in contrast to that quota that I opened with, I don't think we can rely on improved fertility of soils as to be the driver of this. Now, clearly, we need to build up soil organic carbon stocks for a host of other reasons, including climate change mitigation, but also other ecosystem services. And it seems unlikely that farmers are simply going to find an economic driver from increased yields to be sufficient to persuade them to it on alone. And we will have to look at other ways of driving adoption of these practices. And the final point that I'd like to make is, of course, that in order to build up soil organic carbon, we have to change the management that's happening. And it's likely that changed management is going to be the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on yields, rather than the changed soil properties from having more soil organic carbon. So, for example, if you introduce cover crops, those cover crops will have an impact on yields. If they're legume ones, they might increase your nutrient supply and increase crop yields. If they're non-leguminous ones and you don't increase your fertilizer to deal with nitrogen immobilization, you may see a decrease in yields, as has been observed in the recent studies across the US, for example. So those kind of impacts on the management are really going to be the thing which drives the interaction between soil organic carbon sequestration yields, much more than the soil health, soil properties effect that people have really talked so much about in the past. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it back to Budiman there, and we're about to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic, for the presentation and the provoking thought. So let's continue with the next speaker first, and then I'll introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mauricio Cherubin. Mauricio is a professor at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. So he's an agronomist with a lot of research experience at different institutes in soil science, plant nutrition, and environmental biogeochemistry. And he is the current Deputy General Coordinator and the Research Director of the newly established Center for Carbon Research in Tropical Agriculture at University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. So over to you, Mauricio.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen? Yeah, let's go. So I think this talk very fast is complementary to the talk with Professor Dominic, because I will focus on some cases in tropical area in Brazil, especially talking about cover crops and the impacts on soil carbon and crop yields. So the title is Soil Health, the Foundation for a Resilient Tropical Agriculture. Let's talk about carbon and crop yields. Let's see. So the big question for us is how to increase yields in tropical agriculture in a changing climate. So this is the big question for around the world. And I believe we need system more efficient, resilient, and sustainable. For that, today, we can see the advance of the regenerative agriculture in a global scale. In Brazil is not different. And the principle for this type of agriculture is based on enhance the soil health. So when we increase the soil health, we are increasing soil carbon and other benefits, for example, crop yield, water, and of course, biodiversity. So healthy soils, in theory, leads to high crop yields and also to high carbon sequestration. Well, for me, the plant is the key of the system. So the plants are able to capture the CO2 from the atmosphere, and the soil is the safe, where we storage carbon, we stabilize and sequester carbon. And when we have more carbon, we have a positive feedback on the soil health, increasing chemical, physical, and biological pillars. And of course, healthy soils has a direct impact on the plants. So it's a cycle. And the keywords for that is intensification and especially diversification. We need to put more plants on the system. This is the key for tropical system, as we can see some example from now. And for that, Professor Dominic told us about cover crops. Cover crops, for me, in Brazil, is the best option to increase carbon, because we are using a very specific window along the year, and we have a multiple or a multifunctionality of these plants in the soil. So soil erosion control, and soil cover, and nutrient cycling, biodiversity, soil carbon. soil discompaction, and so on. So cover crops are one of the best strategy to increase the sustainability of our cropping systems. It's not the only alternative, but it's one of the best strategy. So based on that, let's see some field studies that we are running right now across the country. The first one is from my student, Vitória Souza. Is an experiment here in the middle of Brazil, in the Rio Verde city, is in Goiás state. The gray part of Brazil is Cerrado, is the Brazilian savanna. So it's exactly in the middle. This is a 5 years experiment. We can see the difference between the crop rotation. Soybean fallow, it could be normal in that region because we have a rain season and after that a dry season, but we can use some cover crops. And I am showing only the contrast between fallow and a mix composed by crotalaria, some hemp, some Africa grass, urocloa, and millet. So it's two grass and one legume on that. And the conclusion is in 5 harvests, the adoption of this type of mix of cover crops result in an additional 4,200 kilograms of soybeans. It's like a one more season in 5 years. It's incredible. So this is the type of result that we can convince the producer to use this type of strategy. And we are starting to study also the variation across the years. So this is a very simple metric, coefficient of variation, and we can see insight in the mix. We have a low variation across the years, along the years. It means it's more stable. So it's very aligned with the strategy to more resilient system in this time where the climate is more complex, let's see. And when we see the average, we can see an increase in soil carbon. Let's see the iron. We can see high crop yield in average. We can see high enzyme activity. It show us the soil is more active, is more healthy, and also we can see a small but significant increase in carbon content in these areas. So the relationship between soybean and carbon is 0 to 52. So I don't know exactly the cause effect, but we have a correlation. And in this type of system, we have other benefits. For example, lower nematodes and weed population, and also high nutrient cycling. And it was published by a paper this year. In another place close to Goiás, in Mato Grosso state, also in the center part of Brazil, the same style of experiment, field experiment, we can see more or less the same history. Year by year, except some more challenging years. Probably 2018 was a really good year in terms of rain. So the cover crop mix has no too much effect on that. And the conclusion is in 8 harvests, right now we have one more harvest. It's a good harvest. So again, it's a good reason to convince someone to use this type of technique or strategy. It's financial, it's economics. So we have to think about that. And in terms of crop yield stability over the time, it's very, very weak, this relation, this difference, but we can see a small advantage for the mix adoption. And when we see the correlation between carbon and soybean yields, we can see 0.5, 0.6. This is the relation with a Pearson correlation. In another experiment in Mato Grosso state, it's a beautiful experiment conducted by Mato Grosso Foundation. We can see a 15 years experiment where the colleagues are testing two systems with a fallow in no tillage system and in conventional tillage, and 3 succession strategies and 3 rotation strategies. It's too much detail to talk about that right now, but let's see the results in a broad vision. So in the first 6-7 years, all the treatments respond in the same way. So, oh, what happened here? The theory is not confirming the reality, but in the season of 2014-15, we have in that region a really strong drop, and in that time, the colleagues could see the soybean and fallow system are less resilient, and the crop yield dropped very high, very significantly. So take a look in the curves. The crop yield reduced here, and after that, the climate improved, but they never can achieve the same level again. So it's really interesting because a very high stress leads to a low crop yield in the system. And the colleagues measured soil carbon stocks in 2020 and see the average of these 5 treatments here is 100 tons per hectare, and for both low yield treatments was 77 tons per hectare. So we have a difference. It's a carbon stock for 0 to 30. And one interesting decision that was done was to replace the conventional fallow treatment was replaced by African grass, Brachiaria or Urochloa husisiensis. And look, the response of crop yield was recovered in 3 or 4 years. So soil health is recovering, and crop yield too, also. And how about carbon? Soil carbon, we just sampling the soil 3 weeks ago, so the results are coming. Let's see if the carbon stocks continue have this type of difference that was saw a few years ago. The last example that I mentioned here is in a little bit north part of Brazil, actually northeast, is in Tocantins state. It's the newest and largest agriculture frontier in Brazil. So it's a really strategic, important region for the country and of course for the world. So in that place, the rain season is a little bit shorter than other region, and we cannot adopt a second crop. So the strategy in that region was overseeding the cover crops inside the soybean in the end of the soybean cycle. So we tested 5 treatments for African grass, 2 panicum and 2 Urochloa, and millet. So we can see the dry mass production is really different. We are talking about almost 10,000 against 2,000 kilograms, so it's really different. And the results in terms of crop yield is also different. So compared to the fellow treatments, we can see gains of about 13 to 18 bags. We are talking about 60 kilograms, or we are talking about almost 1,000 kilograms of surplus in this type of treatments. Millet, we found about 1/3 of that. It's really important for us because millet is the most spread cover crop in Brazil, particularly in the center part of Brazil, and we are seeing in some case is not the best solution. We can choose other cover crops. And why this type of results appear? Because African grass are more rustic, water efficient, and we can have an active cover for more time in the field. So the plant is alive for a longer time. In contrast, the millet is a very fast crop. The cycle is very short, and after 2 or 3 months, it starts to be dry and dead. So the composition starts and is really different than African grass. So we call passive cover, not active. And in this field experiment, we can see the correlation between soybean yields with cover crop biomass. So it expected, but we saw the results, and also we could found the correlation between soybean yields with soil carbon stocks, particularly in the very surface layer 0 to 10. And when we see the rate of change, these are, I forgot to mention, this is a 10-year experiment there. So when we see the average change in soil carbon stocks, we can see numbers ranging from 100 to 300, 400 for 0 to 30. When we use African grass, and the soil is losing carbon when we use millet. So it's incredible. And when we consider 0 to 100, the number is, of course, is higher, and we still are losing carbon in the millet. So each cover crop has a potential, and we need to study the potential for each region because it's different. And sometimes the best solution is to mix more than one, because we have legumes and grasses and maybe other families, botanic families also. And to finish my talk, we did a exploratory analysis with data from farmers that was enrolled in a national soybean yield contest. So good farmers distributed across the country. And we couldn't see a very good relationship between soybean yields and soil organic matter. It's a very dispersed data set here. But in my opinion, it's very new. But in my opinion, in that scale, is a national scale, we have climate, we have soil types different. So the effect of management practices are diluted in this type of variation. But when we see more in a more regional scale, by state, Bahia state, Mato Grosso state, and São Paulo state, we can see better or higher correlation between soil organic matter and crop yield. So, of course, in a more regional scale, we have the impact of management practices more important, and so we can see better this type of correlation. So to finish my talk, I would like to reinforce I am very optimistic. So I can see a really nice movement in terms of agriculture in these couple years from now and for the next couple years. So regenerative agriculture can be or is a platform for sustainable transformation, particularly in tropical region, in tropical agriculture. So we must to enter in a virtuous cycle. Healthy soils with chemical, physical, and biological pillars very balanced. We can see results in terms of crop yields, and higher crop yields make more money for the farmers, and farmers when they have more money, of course they will invest more in the land. It's obvious, and this is the virtuous cycle for us. Today we are, and farmers are seeing crop yield as the only way to earn money, but in the near future it's happened right now. In fact, we are talking about soil carbon credit, biodiversity credit, carbon footprint, low carbon footprint in the products, and water, some type of certification. So the benefits for the farmers will be multiples. So the farmers will be more happy to adopt some type of management practice to improve soil carbon and soil yield and crop yield and so on. So guys, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mauricio. Muito obrigado, and thanks for the presentation and the very exciting results. So maybe we just go ahead with a discussion with Beverly, so to save time. And for the audience, if you have questions that you would like to ask the presenters, please put it on the Q&A section of the Zoom that is on the menu. Okay, over to you, Beverly.
Thank you, Budi, and particularly thank you to Mauricio and Dominic for those. The presentations were brilliant, and I have so many questions. But I'd just like to start with a fairly broad comment, and then I'd like to get your response to that, because it's such a complex topic. And there are clearly so many complex interactions in the relationship between crop productivity on the one hand and soil organic carbon content on the other. And it's not necessarily linear, it's not necessarily one-to-one, and it goes in both directions. All of these things confound any effort that we make to establish the mechanisms for that relationship. But despite all that complexity, there's a general acceptance that soil organic matter is good for the soil and it's good for production. And there's a positive correlation between soil organic matter, soil health, and plant productivity, even if it's not causal. Can soil organic carbon be an integrative indicator of productivity, even if it's marginal or a small amount on top of everything else? And the reason I'm going through all this is to say that in my own engagement with farmers and with policy, I've tried to encourage support for good management practices that build soil organic matter on the basis of promising high yields and a good cost-benefit relationship for farmers in particular and for the economy. Now, you know, from what the recent studies are showing, this isn't absolutely straightforward. And I'm just would like to get your comments on what we can say in a simplified way to encourage policy and agricultural practices to be adopted that sort of integrates this complex science. So perhaps I'll ask Dominic to start and then ask Mauricio.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Beverly. That's a great point and great question. So I guess there's multiple parts of the question. So the first one, I think, is the easier part, is can we use soil organic carbon as part of a tool to predict yields and show that, and clearly I think from the evidence that both Mauricio and myself have showed, yes, it is a contributing factor towards yields, and we can certainly model that and quantify that at this stage, not even though recognizing there are a lot of uncertainties around that. Yeah, we can point to that being a causal effect that we can quantify. I think a second broader question is the more interesting and difficult one, is what should we be saying to policymakers and farmers in order to encourage them to adopt good practice? And here I think it's really important to give two things. One, contextualized advice, and two, not to raise expectations too far for homogeneous types of practice. So, for example, we've seen from Mauricio and from many other studies that cover crops can increase yields, but we also see evidence from farmer practice across the US, collecting real on-farm data from farmers who have adopted cover crops, that up till now, yields have gone down on average by about 5%. So we have to understand why that is. We know that cover crops can improve yields, and then we also know that when farmers do it, they're not seeing that. So they clearly need a lot more contextualized information. I think there are a few things going on there. One is that when farmers start using new practices, they are learning as they go, and they maybe not practicing it in the best way they could. Other factors are things like the fact that farmers may be driven by economic factors, such as what type of seed they're buying. For the most part in the US, and I don't know whether it's, I think the same is broadly true in Brazil, that they typically just using cereal crops because they're very much cheaper, rather than these mixes or legume ones, which we know perform better. And the cost of seed and losses of seed to predation are actually a limiting factor on use of more expensive seeds that we know perform better. And so we need to do a couple of things. We need to teach farmers what they could do with best practice, more contextualized, but also they need to understand how to use these things better. For example, farmers are typically not adjusting their fertilization rates necessarily when they add these cereal crops into their rotations. And then we're getting nitrogen immobilization when those residues are ploughed in, and that's causing a hit to yields. And the third thing that's going on is that we're giving advice which is being applied everywhere, which shouldn't be applied everywhere, and the climate is a big factor there. If you do cover crops, for example, in an arid climate, it can compete for soil moisture, and that can be a big factor in your subsequent main crop. That if you've actually got a season that's starting off with less moisture stored in the soil because the cover crop has depleted it, that will also deplete yields. So we really need to be getting much better about giving the right information about the right practice in the right place, and it's really heterogeneous, and having very simple messages that we should be doing this everywhere, is probably harmful in the long run, because people will try it out, find it doesn't work for them, and then that's the message that people will learn from it. So that was a long-winded answer. I'll pass over to Mauricio.
Thank you.
Well, I am in line with Professor Dominic. Of course, carbon is for me, is the key indicator of soil health, because they interact with the chemical, the physical, and the biological pillars. So, but not the only indicator. It's important. We need to evaluate all the components, because carbon is good, but it's not enough. So this is one point. And another point, we in Brazil, a couple years ago, start several initiatives with about carbon farming, looking for the carbon credits. It's in Brazil and around the world, but the narrative was not so good. Start to talk with the farmers about carbon credit, but carbon credit is in the end of a long journey. So my point, and several colleagues, is to put carbon in the context where carbon is a consequence of a good management to increase crop yields. So the farmers will adopt a given practice if the result will be more crop and more money. So this is the context. So carbon is a consequence on that process. So we are changing the narrative right now. So for example, cover crops or integrated system, Brazil has about 7 million hectares of integrated system, crop, livestock, and forestry, and so on, many configuration. And we can see really, really nice results. But at the end, we need to make this type of system more profitable. This is the question for the farmers. And for politicians, they need to be educated, because politicians and farmers and field consultants, carbon is different than phosphorus and potassium. It's completely different. The amount, the dynamics, the process involved, and for increasing carbon in the soil, in the field, takes time. We need to have a good crop rotation plan and wait and see each by year, in each year, wait, and we can see a small increment. It's completely different than fertilizer. We put and we see the difference in the next crop. And all the agronomists in the field are very comfortable with the fertilizer dynamic. They put and see the results. And when we talk about carbon, we need, look, you need to wait to see the results. It's this type of knowledge and perception is really crucial to adopt a more sustainable agenda in Brazil or US or other places. We are very, I don't know in English, immediatist. We can see the results very fast. But when we talk about carbon, we need to take more time to see the results and to see the benefits of that. So it's a question of education and to outreach this type of information in the field, in the Congress, and all the places.
Thank you both. And I think that sort of leads into another really critical question, a question that it's just another observation that farmers are very intent on increasing their yields. I mean, that's their production, that's their profit. And they find it easier to throw on a bag of nitrogen fertilizer rather than to think in that long-term context of building soil function and condition through building soil carbon. But I was very interested in Mauricio's graph of the variation and the relationship between drought and climate variations and crop yields. And I think building that resilience is really important. So it relates to the time frame for carbon sequestration as well. And one of the observations that we make here in Australia is that farmers have a problem getting their head around that long-term need to build soil carbon as opposed to how much they can make in a season or a cycle of farming. And that's just a very natural business approach. So I think that the messages and the understanding that's coming through now from the research that you're doing is absolutely critical in that regard. So, you know, I don't know whether you'd like a quick comment, but I see the time's moving on, and there may be some questions from the audience too. So I might leave it there unless you would like to make a quick comment on that resilience factor.
Yes, I can make a very quick comment. Actually, I will talk about Brazil because I have this experience here. Actually, I'm saying right now to adopt this type of technology or management practices is not a question of only mitigation. It's a question of adaptation, because we have in Brazil, it's incredible. Right now in south part, we have flooding and it's a chaos. And in northeast, we have drought. So it's a very complex climate in the last couple of years. So this type of system, more resilient, is a question of adaptation. It doesn't matter if you want or not, but you have to do that to stay as a farmer and stay in a profitable system. It's an obligation. This is the point. We need to change right now. We have no more time to ask, to see the neighbors if it works or not. We need to act, to put some strategy on the field and see the results. It's very, very urgent, this type of change in the mind and in the practice as well.
Thank you. Budi, I'll hand back to you now. And
Thanks,
thank you both.
So perhaps we take a couple of questions from the audience. But before that, maybe I have a comment. And the reverse is also probably true, that a loss in soil organic carbon is not something that we can see the immediate effect. It's more of a chronic effect that's probably that no one really put so much effort in, because for example, if acidification, we can see that it's a direct effect that affects crop yield, but perhaps the effect of organic carbon loss is more chronic, that people can't see the effect. So that goes to a question to Dominic from Julio, the audience. So he said that, can you say something about the opposite case in areas where yields has collapsed and relative to previous years, that they are not due to disaster? Can you say how much of it is due to the loss of soil carbon?
Hi, yeah, that's a great question, Julio. So yes, absolutely, but not from the data that I was showing in the talk, but from other data I've seen. We can see in many cases that soil degradation is the leading cause of abandoning cropland. And for example, during my work in East Africa, I saw really striking examples of that, where locations which have been cropped for many years have become extremely degraded, the soils. Eventually they can't sustain crops at all. They move to grazing on them. The degradation and the erosion carries on apace. And eventually they have to abandon even grazing on these areas. They become utterly barren and just covered in gully erosion. Some of the sites I see are just like a lunar surface even in some of these places. But I want to move to a more optimistic note on that, which is what we really observed over there is how reversible these things are. We saw places which had been turned into completely barren landscapes, and where sustainable land management practices, whether it excluded livestock and are actually doing cut and carry practices and allowing native grasses and trees to regenerate, that the soils recovered remarkably within a decade or two. You're already seeing it transformed into a lush ecosystem. So the really positive thing I saw about that is that, yes, soil degradation makes land impossible to use, but we can reverse that. We know how to. And in fact, it's the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So in theory, we should be on a mission within the 2020s to actually reverse all of this worldwide. I don't think we will achieve that, but as an aspiration, we know how to do it, and we need to push on that. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
Thank you, Dominic. So a question to Mauricio. So Jose is asking that, do you think that the yield and economic profits due to the adoption of cover crops is enough to pay off the investment for the cover crops? Or do you think that there needs to be some subsidies?
It's a good question. I think it's possible to pay the bills with the benefits that the cover crop will provide in the system. We can see some results, and we are not talking about receive money from the government to implement this type of strategy. There is many initiatives across the country, funding by private sector encouraging farmers to adopt this type of management practices as cover crops. But the data, the results show us that it's possible to pay for the seeds and for all the activity with the benefits in terms of crop yield. And maybe in the future or in a couple of years, the farmers can get a little extra money from carbon credit as well. So it's help to pay the bill. This is the point.
Probably a follow-up question from Angelica. Do you consider how you manage the cover crops at the end, whether it's terminated or incorporated?
Sorry, let's see if I understood. How we finish the cover crop in the field?
Yes. Yes.
We are talking about herbicide or knife rollers. So depends of the system. Most of them we can use a knife roller. It's a mechanical strategy to finish and stay the field for a while. And before the sowing season, we use some herbicide for regrowing species. So this is a more regular system that we are using in Brazil.
And a question to Dominic from Angelica is that you mentioned at the end that to possible increase crop yield of 0.7%. So what kind of management practice that you are thinking of that currently can achieve such increase?
Yeah. So yeah, as you're reading it, I think the point of the question is how do we get past that 0.7%? What kind of management should we do to actually push the boundary up further than that? And so I think that, well, there are two sides to that. The first is that 0.7% that I talked about is the increase we get only from the soil properties themselves. As I also mentioned at the end, the management itself changes practice. So doing the right practices which happen to build soil carbon as a side effect, if they also benefit yields of practices, so using cover crops that provide nutrients, so having legumes in the mix, for example, we can do practices which both address yield and that address soil organic carbon simultaneously. And that's the first line of what we need to be doing. But that has geographic limitations. So, for example, no-till is one of the processes we know that can build soil organic carbon. But what we typically find is that in dry areas, the reduced evapotranspiration means that it can be beneficial to yields there. And adoption is quite high in places where it benefits yields, but it doesn't work everywhere. So we're not going to see adoption of those practices in places where it doesn't benefit yield. So there's the geographic variation of we need to advocate what works where, and that we can improve yields through the management, not just through the soil organic carbon. The second part of the question is looking further ahead, what kinds of practices which aren't readily available now could we be looking at? And I think, well, some of them are starting to become available now. Biochar is one that I work in heavily, and I think that's got a lot of potential to build soil organic carbon levels far beyond what we can do from adding just raw organic matter. And it's in many places, especially in the tropics, we see big improvements on yields, but less so in the temperate regions. The other things we can do are things like genetic modification of crops. So people talk, for example, about better root architectures. So if you can have more allocation below ground, which doesn't necessarily, doesn't necessarily reduce above ground, you're not just reallocating below ground, because if you can access more water and nutrients with better root architecture, you can have a win-win where you're building up more soil organic carbon and simultaneously tackling yields. And also things like breeding out photooxidation from many of our crops. So our C3 crops are not very efficient at using sunlight for photosynthesis, and I think there are opportunities to actually create crops that do that better. And looking further ahead as well, there may be opportunities for having perennial crops used more. Many of the cereal crops that we use now actually come from wild populations that are either perennial or have perennial relatives in them, and we can get those genes back in so that could be beneficial. That's a tough and hard thing to do. There's modest success with it at the moment. We have sort of chernza and some grains which are achieving commercial success because there's a demand for it now. I think that's a long process that some decades away may yield benefit. So there is a lot of different things we can tackle. Yeah.
Thanks, Dominic and Mauricio. Maybe one last question from Chu. And he said that in sub-Saharan Africa, there are many challenging features such as inherently poor soils, harsh climate, and low capital and high population with a high demand of food. So maybe if you can have a take-home message for what kind of effort should the farmers effort to increase the soil carbon and also crop yield?
Yeah, it's
Maybe
a challenging question, right? But let's see, let's start. I have a chance to visit Morocco last year. I will again now in the conference in the end of May. Of course, Morocco is in another region, but I talk with many colleagues from Sub-Saharan Africa, and we can realize, especially in the center part of Brazil, we have the climate and the soil types, and more or less the environmental condition is close to the African, close to that region in Africa. And in the 70s, we didn't produce almost nothing in that area. So soil was acid, and we have a lot of problems there. And we start, I can see a revolution with no-till system, and use some lime to correct the pH, and start to adapt our crops to that. So Brazil was an importer, is an food insecurity country 50 years ago, 50 years ago, and now we are one of the largest exporter country. So most of this change occur in the center part of Brazil, that is more or less the same in Africa. So I guess we need to start with some good knowledge and training people there. It's hard to say that, but I'm doing a global analysis of soil health studies, and we can see a very blind spot in Africa. So it's important to have field educators to start the process, to use some practices. In my opinion, the first one is lime, to reduce the soil acidity, and to start to use some cover crops adapted for that, with high efficiency water, to have a soil cover, to start to retain more water. The soil moisture will be high, and we have chance to increase soil organic matter, nutrient recycling, and increase the yield step by step. So it's a really complex question. We need to know if the local people are willing to do that. This is the most important question, and how they want to do that. The politicians are in the same page or not? So we have many. It's a complex equation, and unfortunately, in my opinion, is not only a technical equation. There is much more than technical aspect involved on that. It's, for me, is the main barrier to do that in that region in Africa.
Yeah, if we have time, I can maybe add to that a little bit. I'll try to be brief, but so I have spent a bit of time working, particularly in East Africa. Also have connections with the CCAF's group, the Climate Change and Food Security arm of the CG there. And through that, I think, yeah, absolutely, as is stated in the question, the complex interaction of poverty, poor soils, high demand, and all of these factors coming together make it extremely challenging. So I think there are a couple of sides to that. One that I'd like to mention is from a food security program in Ethiopia I did some work on, saw some really nice results from development agencies incentivizing through direct payments farmers to work on soil and water conservation programs with big improvements to crop resilience, as yield resilience, particularly much more than yield, maximum yields in a good year, but resilience against the poor years was massively improved. And the other side is that the answers, as Mauricio alluded, may be outside of the agricultural system. One of the reasons that we have very poor soils in these is because people are so resource constrained. They use absolutely everything. Crop residues do not go back into the soil by and large. They go into forage, and they go into fuels, and they go into building materials. And that leads to a cycle of degradation. And if you want to fix that, you need to address sustainable development as a bigger picture, whereby people have access to other sources of energy, protein, and materials, so that they don't become absolutely dependent on these resources that can grow on the farm, and thereby deplete their farm by taking everything they need from the soil and more than it can give. So I think it's a big question of addressing sustainability overall, so that people can put their organic matter back into the soil rather than use it for all their other needs.
Okay, thanks everyone. So thanks for the great presentation and discussion. So yeah, it's really enlightening, and it's really engaging with all this discussion. So thank you everyone. So just before we go, I'd like to have a small announcement. So the next webinar that we will have is as continuing of this series is about soil health. So we talk a lot about soil health, but what are parameters that we can measure, and how can we measure it? So next month on the 6th of June, so please tune in again. So this is where we talk about soil health with Professor Christine Morgan from the Soil Health Institute and Dr. Yeda Mendes from Embrapa Cerratos. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you next time.